There is a specific kind of life that produces a specific kind of ending, not dramatic, not cinematic, not the ending that the mythology surrounding the life would have scripted if the mythology had been given a choice in the matter. The ending that a life like Chuck Norris's produces is the ending of a man who spent 86 years doing the thing he believed in with the consistency and the seriousness that the thing required, and who was still doing it in the final days of his life, with the same unhurried commitment he had brought to it when he was 22 years old, and learning to fight on a military base in Korea, and had no particular reason to believe that the thing he was learning would become the organizing principle of everything that followed. Snorts. The world learned on the morning of March 20th, 2026, that Chuck Norris had died the previous day on the island of Kauai in Hawaii. He was 86 years old. His family posted the statement on his official Instagram account in the early hours of that Friday morning, and the statement was brief and honest in the way that statements from people who are genuinely grieving tend to be brief and honest, which is because the people writing them do not have the energy that performance requires and are therefore left with nothing but the true thing, which is always shorter than the performed version and always more powerful for being shorter. The statement said that his passing had been sudden. It said he had been surrounded by his family. It said he had been at peace. It asked for privacy. And then it said the thing that the people who had known him across the decades of his public life recognized immediately as the true thing, which was that to the world he had been a martial artist and an actor and a symbol of strength, and that to them he had been a devoted husband and a loving father and grandfather and the heart of their family. The world received the news in the specific way that the world receives the news of the death of a man who has been part of its cultural furniture for long enough that his presence has become something the world takes for granted, which is with a brief, disoriented silence followed by the slow assembling of the understanding that the presence is now permanently past tense and that the furniture has changed in a way that cannot be changed back. To understand what the final years of Chuck Norris's life actually contained, you have to understand what the final years of Chuck Norris's life looked like from the inside, which is to say you have to set aside the mythology long enough to see the man. Clear as throat, the mythology had been building for 60 years by the time the final decade arrived. It had started with the tournament championships in the 1960s and had grown through the film career of the 1970s and 1980s and had reached a kind of critical mass in the early 2000s when the internet discovered him and produced the Chuck Norris Facts, the collection of hyperbolic statements about his toughness and his capability that circulated through the early social media ecosystem with a velocity that surprised everyone, including Chuck himself. He found them genuinely funny. He said so publicly and repeatedly and without the careful management that celebrities sometimes deploy when they are pretending to find something funny that they actually find threatening. He found them funny because he understood the difference between the mythology and himself well enough to appreciate the mythology as a separate thing, a cultural artifact that had taken on its own life independent of the man it was nominally about, and that could be enjoyed on its own terms, without requiring the man to either inhabit it or defend against it. That quality of self-knowledge, the ability to hold the mythology and the reality as two distinct things without confusing one for the other, was one of the qualities that the people who knew him well consistently identified as central to who he actually was underneath. Everything the world had decided he was. Snorts. The final decade of his life was quieter than the decades that preceded it in the way that the final decades of long lives tend to be quieter, not because the man inside them had diminished, but because the world around them had reorganized its attention toward younger men and newer stories, and the particular kind of novelty that the entertainment industry requires, in quantities that the careers of aging action stars cannot sustainably provide. Walker, Texas Ranger had ended its original run in 2001 after 8 seasons and 200 episodes. The film work had slowed and then stopped. The public profile that had been maintained at high intensity across 4 decades had settled into the lower but more durable register of a man who had become an institution rather than a current event. He was invited to things. He was honored at things. He appeared at things when the things merited his presence, and declined the things that did not in the direct, unhurried way of a man who had spent enough of his life in front of audiences to have developed an accurate sense of which audiences deserved the investment of his presence, and which were simply trading on his name. Clear's throat. What he did with the time that the quieter register made available to him was train. He trained in his home gym in Navasota, Texas, where he and his wife Gina had built a life on a ranch property that suited the specific combination of physical space and privacy that a man like Chuck required to live at the pace that made sense to him, He trained in the morning with the consistency of a man for whom the morning training session was not a discipline imposed on the day, but the foundation on which the rest of the day was built. The thing that came first because it was the most important thing, and the most important things come first when a man has been organizing his life around genuine priorities for long enough that the organization has become instinctive rather than effortful. He trained at 60, he trained at 70, he trained at 80. The people who encountered him in these years and who had expected the training to have diminished in proportion to the age invariably reported the same surprise, which was that the quality of the movement was not the movement of a man of his age, but of something considerably younger, that the speed at which his hands and feet moved, and the precision with which they arrived, where he intended them to arrive were qualities that the number did not predict, and that the number alone could not account for. Snorts. The final years had not been without their losses. Chuck Norris had lived long enough to experience the specific grief of outliving people he loved. And the final years contained more of that grief than any previous period of his life, because that is what long lives accumulate at their end. The losses of the people who populated the earlier chapters and who depart across the final one, until the man who remains is carrying an accumulation of absences that the world outside him cannot fully see or account for. His mother Wilma had died in 2024. She had lived to 102, which is itself a statement about the specific quality of the family that produced Chuck Norris, and her death at that age was not a surprise in the way that early deaths are surprises, but it was a loss of the kind that men who had complicated relationships with difficult fathers tend to feel most completely with the death of the mother who was the stable center of the early life. The person whose presence had been constant when other presences were unreliable. He had spoken about her in interviews across the decades, with the specific tenderness that men of his generation and his background tend to reserve for their mothers, and the tenderness was genuine in the way that things are genuine when they have been tested by time, and found to remain true regardless of what else in a life has changed. Clear's throat. His first wife, Dion Holacek, with whom he had built the early years of his adult life, and with whom he shared children, and the specific history of a young marriage that forms in the years before a man knows what he is going to become, died in December of 2025. They had divorced in 1989 after 31 years of marriage, and had maintained across the years since the specific relationship that people who have shared a long and significant chapter of their lives sometimes build after the chapter has ended, which is not the relationship of husband and wife, but the relationship of two people who know each other in the way that only shared years of genuine intimacy produce, and who find in that knowledge a connection that does not require the original structure to remain meaningful. Her death in the winter before his own was another absence added to the accumulation that the final years had been building, and the people close to him said that he carried it with the same quality he carried everything difficult, which was quietly and without performance, and with the understanding that the carrying was simply what the situation required of him, and that the requirement was met by meeting it rather than by talking about meeting it. The health challenges of the final years were real in the way that the health challenges of a man who has spent 60 years asking his body to do things that most bodies are not asked to do are real, which is seriously and with consequence, but also within the specific context of a body that had been maintained across that entire period with a level of care and discipline that meant the consequences arrived later and with less force than they would have arrived in a less disciplined body. Snorts. There had been concerns across the preceding years about the physical toll that decades of film work and martial arts training and the specific accumulated impact of a life spent in genuine physical engagement had taken on his joints and his cardiovascular system. Gina, his wife of nearly 30 years, had spoken publicly in earlier years about health concerns that had required significant medical attention and that had produced in her a fear for his well-being that she had navigated with the specific courage of a woman who loves a man whose relationship with physical risk is so deeply established that asking him to change it would be asking him to change the thing that made him who he was. He had navigated his own health concerns with the same practical directness he brought to everything, addressing what needed to be addressed and continuing to train and continuing to live at the pace that the training made possible and that made the training necessary. The two things fed each other in the specific way that they always had, the practice sustaining the life, and the life sustaining the practice, and neither one possible without the other, in a form that resembled what they actually were when they were working together. Clear's throat. The days before his death were days that the people who learned about them afterward found difficult to reconcile with the ending they preceded, because they were the days of a man who was living rather than the days of a man who was dying, and the distinction was visible in everything that was documented about them. On March 10, 2026, Chuck Norris turned 86 years old. He celebrated his birthday on Kauai, the Hawaiian island where he had been spending time, and he posted on his social media platforms a video of himself training, moving through technique with the specific quality of movement that had characterized his practice for 60 years. And the caption he chose for the post was the caption of a man who had found in the mythology that surrounded him, a phrase that captured something true about his actual experience of being himself at 86, which was that he did not age, he leveled up. The post received over 300,000 likes. The comments were the comments of people who had grown up watching him and who found in the image of him training on his birthday at 86 a confirmation of something they had decided to believe about the man, which was that he was the exception to the rules that applied to everyone else, and that the exception would continue indefinitely. 9 days later, he was hospitalized. The hospitalization was sudden in the way that the family described it as sudden, which was not the sudden of a man who had been declining toward a crisis, but the sudden of a medical event that arrived without the warnings that declining health typically sends ahead of itself. A friend who had been on the phone with him on the day of his hospitalization said that he had been in good spirits, that he had been cracking jokes, that he had been working out. Snorts. He died on March 19, 2026. He died, surrounded by his family on an island where he had been doing what he had been doing his entire adult life, which was training and living at the pace the training made possible. His family kept the specific circumstances private in the way that families are entitled to keep private the specific circumstances of the deaths of people they love, and the privacy was respected by the people who understood that the family's request for it was genuine and that the genuine request deserved a genuine response. The world received the news and produced the tributes that the world produces when it loses a man who has been part of its landscape for long enough that the landscape feels different without him. The tributes came from the expected sources, and from unexpected ones, and from people who had known him, and people who had only known his work, and people for whom the work had meant something specific and personal that they had never had occasion to express before. The moment of his death gave them the occasion. Clear's throat. Dolph Lundgren wrote a tribute. He wrote it himself, without an assistant, sitting at his desk and typing the words that the 46 years since a Saturday afternoon in Long Beach had given him to say about the man who had taught him the most important thing he had learned in a martial arts career that had taken him to the top of European competition and then into a film career that had made his face recognizable to audiences on 6 continents. He wrote that Chuck Norris was the champ. He wrote that he had always looked up to him as a role model. He wrote that Chuck was someone who had the respect and the humility and the strength it takes to be a man. He wrote that he would miss him. He called him his friend. The people who read the tribute, and who knew the history that preceded it, understood that they were reading the public conclusion of a private education that had begun 4 decades earlier, when a 22-year-old Swedish champion had taken a microphone he should not have taken and called out a man in the front row, and the man in the front row had stood up and walked onto the mat in his sport coat and his street shoes, and spent 3 minutes teaching a lesson that the 22-year-old had spent the rest of his life absorbing and being grateful for. Snorts. The martial arts community produced its own category of tribute, the tribute of people who understood what they were losing in the specific and technical sense that practitioners understand what they are losing when a man of genuine and historically significant capability is no longer present in the world. The men who had trained with him, and the men who had competed against him, and the men who had simply been in the same rooms as him across the decades of his practice, and had understood from being in those rooms what the practice at that level actually looked like, these men wrote and spoke about him in the language of the discipline, which is a language that contains more precision and more genuine feeling than it appears to from the outside, because it is the language of people who have given the most honest parts of themselves to the same thing, and who recognize in each other the cost and the reward of that giving. They spoke about the distance management, they spoke about the spinning back kick, they spoke about the quality of the teaching, the specific and unusual combination of genuine capability and genuine generosity that made him the kind of practitioner that other practitioners sought out not just to test themselves against, but to learn from. They spoke about the humility that existed in him alongside the capability in the specific proportion that genuine capability tends to produce genuine humility in men who have been honestly tested, because genuine testing teaches a man the precise location of his own boundaries, and the knowledge of those boundaries tends to produce in him a respect for the boundaries of the practice itself that translates into a respect for every serious practitioner, regardless of where their boundaries fall relative to his own. Clears throat. Carlos Ray Norris had been born on March 10, 1940, in Ryan, Oklahoma, to a family that did not have much in the way of material resources and that had its own complications in the form of a father whose relationship with the family was defined more by his absence and his failures than by his presence and his contributions. He had grown up in the specific way that men who become serious martial artists often grow up, which is with something to prove that the proving of has to come from inside rather than from outside, because the outside is not offering the confirmation that the inside is looking for. He had joined the Air Force in 1958 and had been stationed at Osan Air Base in Korea, and had encountered Tang Soo-do in the way that young American servicemen in Korea in that era encountered it, which is through proximity and curiosity, and the specific appeal that a physical discipline with a clear internal logic holds for a young man who is looking for something to organize his energy around. He had been good at it immediately, in the way that men who are going to become exceptional at something tend to be good at it immediately. Not because immediate goodness is sufficient to produce exceptionality, but because immediate goodness is the early indicator that the particular combination of physical gifts and psychological orientation required to become exceptional is present in the man and will develop if the man is willing to do the work. Chuck Norris had been willing to do the work in a way, and for a duration that very few men in any generation are willing to do it, which is completely and consistently across 6 decades without significant interruption and without the gradual withdrawal of investment that most men make as the life around the practice changes and the demands of the other chapters compete with the demands of the practice for the time and energy that only one of them can ultimately receive. Snorts. He had competed and won and retired from competition and built a film career and built a television career and built a martial arts organization and maintained a family and maintained a faith and maintained the practice across all of it, with the specific consistency of a man who had decided early what mattered most to him and had organized everything else in his life in relation to that decision rather than allowing everything else to gradually displace it. The Chuck Norris facts had said, in their hyperbolic and affectionate way, that Chuck Norris did not sleep. He waited. That Chuck Norris could divide by 0. That when the boogeyman went to sleep every night he checked his closet for Chuck Norris. The facts were jokes. They were very good jokes. They captured something true about the mythology while being completely untrue about the man. The man had slept. The man had made mistakes. The man had experienced grief and loss and the specific difficulties of a long life lived at full commitment. He had been a devoted husband twice and a loving father to 5 children and a grandfather and a brother, and the heart of a family that loved him in the way that families love the person who is their center, which is with a completeness that the world outside the family cannot fully see or account for. Clears throat. He had been at peace when he died. His family said so, and they said it in the way that the people who were in the room say things they actually witnessed, which is with the specific plainness of true statements that do not require elaboration, because the truth of them is already complete. He had been surrounded by his family. He had been on an island where he had been training on his birthday 9 days before. He had been in good spirits and cracking jokes on the morning of the day he was hospitalized. He had lived at the pace that the practice made possible, and the practice had made possible a pace that most men at 86 could not imagine, and that he had maintained because he had never stopped doing the thing that sustained it. He had leveled up, as he said on his birthday, in every year of his life, and had continued leveling up until the leveling stopped, which is the only way a life organized around genuine discipline and genuine commitment is able to stop, which is not gradually and not with the long diminishment that other kinds of lives produce at their end, but suddenly and from a position of full engagement with the thing that made the life what it was. Snorts. The door at the end of the loading dock. The April light coming through in a hard, bright rectangle. The man stepping through it. The door closing behind him. That was the image that the people who had been on stage 16 of the Warner Brothers lot in Burbank in the spring of 1991 carried with them for the rest of their lives when they thought about Chuck Norris. The image of a man who had said what he came to say with his body rather than his words, and had then walked toward the exit at the same unhurried pace he had walked in with, and had stepped through the door into the light and had been gone. The world that he stepped out of in March of 2026 was not a sound stage in Burbank. It was larger than that, and it contained more people who had been changed by his presence in it than any sound stage could hold. But the quality of the exit was the same: unhurried, complete, without performance, without anything added to the moment that the moment did not require. The door opened, the light came through, he stepped into it, the door closed. The man who had spent 86 years finding out what was true about himself, and about the practice, and about the world, and who had shared what he found with everyone willing to pay attention, was gone from the room. The room was different without him. It will remain different. That is what it means when a man like that steps through the door. The room does not go back to what it was before he was in it. It holds the shape of his presence in the specific way that rooms hold the shape of things that actually happened inside them, which is permanently and without the possibility of revision. He was here. He was real. He was the thing the mythology said he was. Not in the hyperbolic way the mythology said it, but in the true way, which is always quieter than the mythology and always more complete. Thank you for watching.